The sun beat down mercilessly on Tamara Wilson's back as she bent over for the 100th time that afternoon, her calloused fingers wrapping around yet another stone in the unyielding soil of what was supposed to become her wheat field. Sweat trickled down her temple, leaving muddy trails through the dust caked on her face. But she didn't dare stop, not when winter would come all too soon, and with it, the stark reality of starvation if this field couldn't yield a proper harvest. It was 1878 in the Nebraska Territory, and Tamara had been alone for precisely 8 months and 13 days since her father's passing. At 23, she had thought herself prepared for the hardships of frontier life, but nothing could have readied her for the crushing solitude and endless labor that came with maintaining their modest homestead alone. She straightened, pressing a hand against her aching lower back, and tossed the stone onto the growing pile at the edge of the field. The basket she'd brought was already overflowing, and her progress seemed laughably small against the vast expanse of stone-riddled earth that remained. "At this rate, I'll be clearing stones when I'm gray and withered," she muttered to herself, reaching for her canteen. The water was warm and tasted of tin, but it soothed her parched throat. As she tilted her head back to drink, the distinct sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze. Visitors were rare this far from town and rarely brought good news. Her father's shotgun was propped against the fence post, but it might as well have been miles away. Slowly, she lowered the canteen and turned toward the sound. A lone rider approached, his broad-shouldered silhouette backlit by the afternoon sun. The stranger rode tall in the saddle of a magnificent chestnut stallion, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Tamara tensed, her hand instinctively tightening around the rock she'd just picked up. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. The rider slowed his horse as he approached the edge of her property, raising one hand in greeting. "Afternoon, madam," he called, his voice carrying across the field with a rich, deep timbre that caught her by surprise. He guided his horse closer, and as the sun no longer blinded her, Tamara could finally make out his features. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with a strong jaw darkened by several days' growth of beard. His eyes, a startling blue against his sun-bronzed skin, assessed her with open curiosity. "You've got yourself quite a task there," he said, nodding toward the field and the basket of stones. Tamara straightened her spine, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance, her faded calico dress stained with dirt, her honey-brown hair escaping its braid in sweaty tendrils. "I manage," she replied curtly. The stranger's mouth quirked up at one corner as he dismounted in one fluid motion. He was tall, with the lean, muscular build of a man accustomed to hard work. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality, a chambray shirt, leather vest, and denim pants tucked into well-used boots. "Name's Reed Montgomery," he said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest in a gesture of respect that seemed almost out of place in these wild lands. "I was riding through, looking for the Campbell place, heard they might be hiring hands for the season." "You're about 5 miles too far east," Tamara replied, relaxing slightly but still keeping her distance. "The Campbell ranch is beyond that ridge." She pointed westward. Reed nodded, replacing his hat. Much obliged, his gaze drifted back to the field and the slow progress she'd made. For a moment he seemed to be deliberating something, then he stepped forward, closing the distance between them with long, purposeful strides. "Let me help you," he said simply, already bending to pick up a stone near her feet. Tamara blinked in surprise. "I didn't ask for help, Mr. Montgomery." "No, you didn't," he agreed, straightening with a particularly large rock in his hand. "But it seems to me that clearing this field alone would take you till Christmas, and I reckon you're hoping to plant a lot sooner than that." He was right, of course, but Tamara wasn't accustomed to accepting charity, especially not from handsome strangers with questioning eyes. Pride warred with practicality as she watched him deposit the rock onto her pile and return for another. "Why would you help me?" she asked finally. "You don't even know my name." Reed paused, looking up at her with those striking blue eyes. "Then perhaps you should tell me, Miss Wilson, Tamara Wilson." She hesitated, then added, "My father homesteaded this land 3 years ago. He passed last winter." Something shifted in Reed's expression, a softening around the eyes, a tightening of his jaw. "I'm sorry to hear that, Miss Wilson." He glanced around at the modest homestead, the small cabin with its freshly patched roof, the chicken coop, the struggling vegetable garden, all maintained by a single pair of hands. Her hands. "My condolences," he continued. "It can't be easy managing all this alone." Tamara swallowed hard against the sudden thickness in her throat. Most people in town had offered perfunctory sympathies when her father died, but few had acknowledged the near impossible task she'd inherited. "Thank you," she managed. "But that still doesn't explain why you'd stop to help a stranger." Reed shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. "My ma raised me to lend a hand where it's needed. And besides," he added, gesturing toward the western sky, "it's getting too late to reach the Campbell place before dark. I'd be obliged if you'd point me toward the nearest creek to make camp for the night." Tamara hesitated. The sensible thing would be to direct him to Willow Creek about a mile north and send him on his way. But the field stretched before her, taunting her with its vastness, and here was a strong back offering assistance with no strings attached, at least none that she could discern. "There's water on the north edge of my property," she said finally. "And if you're truly offering to help, I wouldn't refuse it, but I can't pay you." Reed's smile broadened, transforming his face from merely handsome to something that made Tamara's heart skip a beat. "I wasn't asking for payment, Miss Wilson. Sometimes a good deed is its own reward." He rolled up his sleeves, revealing corded forearms bronzed by the sun. "Now, shall we get to work?" For the next 2 hours they worked side by side in companionable silence. Reed moved with the efficiency of someone well acquainted with physical labor, clearing in 30 minutes what would have taken Tamara half a day. She found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the breadth of his shoulders, the careful way he scanned the ground before each step, the gentle manner in which he occasionally guided her away from patches of ground where snakes might hide. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, Tamara finally broke the silence. "We should stop for today. It'll be dark soon." Reed straightened, pressing a hand against his lower back much as she had done earlier. "You're right." "We've made good progress, though." He surveyed the field with satisfaction. Nearly a quarter of it now lay free of stones, the dark soil ready for tilling. Tamara nodded, allowing herself a small surge of pride. "More than I would have managed in a week on my own." She hesitated, then added, "I've got stew on the stove. It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome to share it before you make camp." A flicker of surprise crossed Reed's face, followed by something warmer. "That's mighty kind of you, Miss Wilson. I'd be honored." As they gathered their tools and headed toward the cabin, Tamara found herself suddenly self-conscious about the modest state of her home. It was clean and serviceable, but far from the comfortable ranch houses of the more established settlers. "It's not much," she said as they approached the weathered porch, "but it keeps out the rain and most of the wind." Reed removed his hat as they entered, his eyes taking in the simple furnishings, the rough-hewn table her father had made, the 2 mismatched chairs, the small iron stove in the corner, and the curtained-off sleeping area. "It's a home," he said simply. "That's more than many can claim out here." His words eased something in Tamara's chest. She gestured to the water basin near the door. "You can wash up if you like. I'll see to the stew." While Reed splashed water on his face and hands, Tamara busied herself at the stove, stirring the rabbit stew she'd prepared that morning. The rich aroma of herbs and meat filled the small cabin, reminding her how hungry she was after the long day's work. "Smells delicious," Reed commented, drying his hands on the towel she'd provided. "Haven't had a home-cooked meal in weeks. Where are you from, Mr. Montgomery?" Tamara asked as she ladled stew into 2 bowls and placed them on the table. Reed settled into one of the chairs, waiting for her to sit before he picked up his spoon. "Originally from Kentucky. My family had a small horse farm there, but after the war." He trailed off, a shadow crossing his features. Let's just say there wasn't much left to go back to. I've been working my way west ever since, taking whatever honest work I can find. Tamara nodded, understanding in her eyes. So many families had been devastated by the Civil War, their homes and livelihoods destroyed. And now you're looking for work at the Campbell Ranch. That's the plan, Reed confirmed, taking a spoonful of stew, his eyes widened in appreciation. This is excellent, Miss Wilson. Thank you, she replied, pleased despite herself. And please call me Tamara. Miss Wilson makes me feel like my schoolteacher. Reed chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to fill the small cabin. Tamara it is then, and I'm Reed. As they ate, conversation flowed more easily than Tamara would have expected. Reed told her about his travels across the country, the odd jobs he'd taken, and the characters he'd met along the way. In turn, she found herself sharing stories of her father, their journey west from Illinois, and the challenges and joys of homesteading. Pa was determined to build something that would last, she said, her voice softening with memory. He had all these plans, expanding the cabin, digging a proper well, maybe even building a windmill someday. He used to say that the harder the work, the sweeter the reward. Sounds like a wise man, Reed observed, and his daughter clearly inherited his determination. Tamara felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. Some would call it stubbornness. The neighbors, the few we have, think I'm foolish for trying to keep the homestead going alone. Mr. Jenkins from the general store offered to buy the land for a pittance, said it would be doing me a favor. Reed's expression darkened. I imagine he did. Men like that count on desperation to make their fortunes. Well, he'll have to find another desperate woman, Tamara said firmly. This land is all I have left of my father. I won't give it up without a fight. I don't doubt that for a moment, Reed replied, a note of admiration in his voice that made Tamara's blush deepen. After they finished eating, Reed insisted on helping with the dishes despite Tamara's protests. Standing side by side at the wash basin, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed plates back and forth, Tamara became acutely aware of his presence in a way that both unsettled and intrigued her. Thank you for the meal, Reed said as they finished. Best I've had in months. It's the least I could do, considering how much you helped me today, Tamara replied. She hesitated, then added, the creek I mentioned is just beyond those cottonwoods to the north. There's good flat ground for camping, and you should find plenty of deadwood for a fire. Reed nodded, reaching for his hat. I appreciate that. He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Would it be presumptuous of me to offer my help again tomorrow? I could spare another day before heading to the Campbells. Tamara should have said no. Proper young women didn't accept extended help from strange men, no matter how polite they seemed. But the thought of returning to the backbreaking, solitary work after experiencing how much easier it was with a partner made the decision for her. If you're truly willing, I wouldn't refuse, she said carefully. But only if you'll let me provide breakfast and dinner in exchange. Reed's smile returned, warming his features. That seems more than fair. I'll see you at first light then. After he left, Tamara moved about the cabin, preparing for bed with an unusual lightness in her step. She told herself it was simply relief at the prospect of having help with the field tomorrow, nothing more. But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the familiar chorus of crickets and distant coyote calls, her thoughts kept returning to Reed's smile and the unexpected kindness in his blue eyes. Don't be foolish, she whispered to herself in the darkness. He's just passing through like all the rest. But even as she drifted off to sleep, a small, rebellious part of her couldn't help hoping that perhaps, just perhaps, Reed Montgomery might linger a little longer than expected. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of another scorching day to follow. Tamara rose before first light, as was her habit, and set about preparing a hearty breakfast. She was just taking biscuits from the oven when a knock sounded at the door. Reed stood on her porch, freshly washed and shaved, his hat in his hands. Good morning, he greeted, a tentative smile on his face as if he half expected her to have changed her mind about accepting his help. Good morning, Tamara replied, stepping back to let him enter. You're right on time. Breakfast is ready. They ate quickly, both eager to make the most of the cooler morning hours. As they walked to the field together, the rising sun gilding the eastern horizon, Tamara found herself studying Reed's profile. There was something comforting about his presence, a steady reliability that reminded her of her father, yet different in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The day passed in much the same way as the previous afternoon, with both of them working diligently to clear the field. By midday, when the sun was high and merciless, they'd cleared nearly half the field. "We should take a break," Reed suggested, wiping sweat from his brow. "Even the most dedicated worker needs rest now and then." Tamara reluctantly agreed, realizing how parched and hungry she was. They retreated to the shade of a large oak at the edge of the property, where she'd left a jug of water and some bread and cheese. As they sat side by side against the rough bark of the tree, a comfortable silence settled between them. Tamara found herself wondering about this man who had appeared so unexpectedly in her life. "May I ask you something, Reed?" she ventured finally. He turned those clear blue eyes toward her. "Of course. Why are you really helping me? And please don't say it's just because your mother taught you good manners." She kept her tone light, but the question had been nagging at her since yesterday. Reed considered her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "When I was riding by, I saw you out there all alone, fighting a battle against that field stone by stone. It reminded me of something my father used to say. The heaviest burdens are the ones we carry alone." He paused, his gaze drifting to the distant horizon. "After he died, my mother tried to keep our farm going by herself. Proud woman, wouldn't accept help from anyone, nearly worked herself to death before our neighbor finally intervened." He looked back at Tamara, his eyes holding hers. "I guess what I'm saying is, I know what it's like to watch someone you care about struggle alone when they don't have to. And while we've just met, I couldn't ride past without offering to lighten your load, even if just for a day or two." Tamara swallowed hard, touched by his honesty and the story behind his actions. "Thank you for telling me that, and for understanding." Reed nodded, seeming relieved that she accepted his explanation. "So, what's your story, Tamara Wilson? How did you end up clearing stones from a Nebraska field all by yourself?" Tamara leaned back against the tree, allowing herself the rare luxury of rest as she collected her thoughts. "My mother died when I was 12 influenza. After that, it was just Pa and me. He was a school teacher back in Illinois, but he always dreamed of having land of his own. When the Homestead Act opened up these territories, he saw his chance." She gestured toward the cabin and the surrounding property. "We came out here 3 years ago. The first year was difficult. We nearly starved that first winter, but we learned, adapted. The second year was better. We managed to grow enough to see us through, even had a little extra to trade in town." Her voice softened as she continued. "Pa had such plans for this place. We were going to build a proper house, expand the fields, maybe even get a milk cow. Then last winter he took a fall while repairing the roof. The injury itself wasn't so bad, but infection set in." She closed her eyes briefly, the pain of the memory still fresh. "He was gone within a week." Reed's hand covered hers briefly, a gesture of comfort that Tamara found herself leaning into rather than pulling away from. "I'm truly sorry, Tamara. Losing a parent leaves a hole that never quite fills." She nodded, recognizing the understanding in his voice. "After the funeral, several people in town suggested I sell the homestead and return east to find relatives or perhaps a husband. As if I could just abandon everything my father worked for, everything we built together." "So you stayed and took on his dream as your own," Reed said, admiration evident in his tone. "I suppose I did," Tamara admitted. "Though some days I wonder if I'm being foolish or brave. From what I've seen, there's a healthy measure of both in you," Reed replied with a small smile. "And that's a fine combination for surviving out here." The rest of the day passed swiftly as they returned to their work with renewed energy. By the time the sun began its westward descent, they had cleared nearly 3/4 of the field, a task that would have taken Tamara weeks on her own. As they walked back to the cabin that evening, physically exhausted but satisfied with their progress, Reed cleared his throat. I've been thinking, Tamara, that field needs plowing before you can plant, and I noticed you don't have a draft horse or ox. Tamara sighed. Pa and I always borrowed Mr. Peterson's plow horse when we needed it, in exchange for help with his harvest. But he moved his family to Oregon last fall, took all his livestock with him. Reed nodded thoughtfully. Well, my horse Rusty isn't exactly a plow horse, but he's strong and willing. With a proper harness, he could do the job. Tamara stopped in her tracks, turning to face him. Are you offering to plow my field as well? I am, Reed confirmed. We could probably finish clearing the stones tomorrow morning and start plowing in the afternoon. Another day after that should see it done. But what about the Campbell Ranch? Tamara asked, confused. You said you were looking for work there. Reed shrugged, a casual gesture that didn't quite match the intensity in his eyes. The Campbells have been hiring hands for 20 years. They'll still need help when I get there in a few days. Tamara studied his face, trying to understand his motives. Why would you delay your plans for me? We're strangers, Reed, are we? He asked softly, after working side by side for 2 days, sharing meals and stories. I'd like to think we're at least becoming friends. Friends. The word hung between them, simple yet profound. Tamara realized with a start that Reed was right somewhere between picking up stones and sharing their histories. They had crossed the boundary from strangers to something more. All right, she said finally. If you're truly willing to help with the plowing, I accept, and I consider us friends as well. Reed's smile could have outshone the setting sun. Then it settled. Now, I believe you promised me dinner in exchange for my help, and I'm famished enough to eat a whole side of beef. Tamara laughed, the sound surprising her with its ease. I'm afraid it's just chicken and dumplings tonight, but there's plenty of it. Even better, Reed assured her as they continued toward the cabin. My mother made the best chicken and dumplings in all of Kentucky. I'd be curious to see how yours compare. That sounds like a challenge, Mr. Montgomery, Tamara replied with mock seriousness. Perhaps it is, Miss Wilson, he returned, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Perhaps it is. Dinner that night was a lively affair, with Reed regaling Tamara with tales of his travels that had her alternating between laughter and wide-eyed wonder. She found herself sharing stories of her own childhood adventures in Illinois, the journey west with her father, the trials and triumphs of their first years on the homestead. It felt strange yet wonderful to speak so freely, to remember the good times without the sharp edge of grief that usually accompanied such memories. As the evening grew late, Reed reluctantly rose to leave. I should get back to my camp. Dawn comes early and we've got a field to finish. Tamara walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him go. Thank you again for your help today, Reed. It means more than I can express. He paused on the threshold, his tall frame silhouetted against the night sky. The pleasure was mine, Tamara, truly. For a brief, breathless moment, she thought he might say something more, might even lean down and... But the moment passed, and with a tip of his hat, Reed disappeared into the darkness. Tamara stood in the doorway long after his footsteps had faded, her heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm. This is madness, she whispered to herself. 2 days, and you're already mooning over him like a schoolgirl. Yet as she prepared for bed that night, she couldn't deny the lightness in her spirit, or the way her thoughts kept drifting to the next day, not just because of the work they would accomplish, but because of the man who would be by her side while they did it. The following morning brought clouds gathering on the western horizon, promising rain by nightfall. Reed arrived at dawn as promised, and after a quick breakfast, they set to work with renewed purpose, eager to finish clearing the stones before the weather turned. By mid-morning, they had completed the task. Tamara stood at the edge of the now stone-free field, her hands on her hips, a sense of accomplishment washing over her. We did it, she said, her voice tinged with wonder. I never thought I'd see this field cleared before planting time. Reed stood beside her, his satisfaction evident in his relaxed stance. It's a good piece of land you've got here, Tamara. Rich soil. Once you get past all those rocks, it should yield a fine crop. If we can get it plowed and planted before the rains set in, she reminded him, glancing at the darkening sky. Then we'd best not waste time. Reed replied, already turning toward where his horse grazed nearby. "I'll fetch Rusty and see what we can rig up for a plow." While Reed went to prepare his horse, Tamara retrieved the old plow from the lean-to behind the cabin. It was a simple implement, designed to be pulled by a single animal, but it had served them well in previous seasons. When Reed returned leading Rusty, Tamara couldn't help but admire the magnificent chestnut stallion. Standing nearly 17 hands high, with powerful shoulders and intelligent eyes, the horse was clearly well cared for despite the rigors of trail life. "He's beautiful," Tamara said, approaching slowly with her hand extended. Reed smiled with obvious pride. "He's been my companion for 5 years now. Got him as a colt, raised him myself. He's strong-willed but loyal to a fault." Rusty sniffed Tamara's hand cautiously, then nudged her palm in a gesture that seemed almost friendly. She stroked his velvet nose, charmed by the animal's gentle demeanor despite his imposing size. "I think he likes you," Reed observed, a warm note in his voice that made Tamara glance up sharply. The look in his eyes a mixture of admiration, and something deeper sent a flush of heat through her that had nothing to do with the morning sun. She cleared her throat, turning her attention back to the horse. "Let's hope he likes pulling a plow as well." They worked together to fashion a suitable harness for Rusty, using the tack Reed had and some rope from Tamara's supplies. It wasn't perfect, but it would serve their purpose. "Have you ever plowed a field before?" Tamara asked as they led the harnessed horse to the edge of the cleared land. Reed chuckled. "I've done my share. My family might have raised horses, but we grew our own crops too. Every spring, my father would put me behind the plow as soon as I was tall enough to reach the handles." Relief flooded through Tamara. She had helped her father with plowing in previous years, but she'd never managed it alone and wasn't entirely confident in her ability to guide the plow properly. "Then I'll leave you to it," she said, stepping back. "I should check on my chickens and perhaps start preparing something for midday." But Reed shook his head, gesturing for her to come closer. "I thought we might do this together, the first few furrows at least." Before Tamara could question him, he positioned himself behind the plow and motioned for her to stand in front of him. Hesitantly, she stepped into the space he indicated, and suddenly found herself enveloped by his presence, his chest warm against her back, his arms reaching around her to grasp the plow handles on either side of her. "Put your hands here," he instructed, his voice close to her ear sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. "The trick is to keep the blade at a consistent depth while maintaining a straight line." Tamara nodded, acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched. She gripped the handles where he showed her, trying to focus on the lesson rather than the man giving it. "Ready?" Reed asked, and when she nodded again, he clicked his tongue to signal Rusty forward. The horse leaned into the harness, and the plow blade bit into the earth with satisfying resistance. Tamara felt the power of it surging through the handles, but Reed's steady hands guided hers, showing her how to adjust the angle and pressure to maintain the perfect furrow. They moved slowly across the field, the rich scent of freshly turned earth rising around them. Tamara gradually relaxed into the rhythm of it, her body working in harmony with Reed's as they guided the plow together. "You're a natural," he murmured after they had completed several rows. "Your father would be proud." The simple words, spoken with such sincerity, pierced straight to Tamara's heart. Tears pricked at her eyes, but they were not entirely from sorrow. There was joy there too, joy in continuing her father's work, in bringing this land to life as he had dreamed. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting her voice with more. They worked until midday, taking turns at the plow. When the sun reached its zenith, they paused to rest and refresh themselves with water and the bread and cheese Tamara had brought out. Sitting in the shade of the cabin's porch, watching the clouds build in the west, Tamara found herself studying Reed's profile once more. The strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the tiny scar above his right eyebrow that she hadn't noticed before. "How did you get that scar?" she asked impulsively. Reed's hand went to the mark, a rueful smile crossing his face. "Horse kicked me when I was 16. My own fault I spooked him while trying to show off for a girl. Tamara laughed. Did it work? Was she impressed by your injury? She was not, Reed admitted with a chuckle. Called me a foolish boy and said she'd never court someone with so little sense. Smart girl, Tamara teased, enjoying the way Reed's eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed. What about you? He asked, his gaze warm on her face. Were there any young men trying to impress you back in Illinois? Tamara shook her head. Not really. I was always too busy helping Pa at the school or with his research. The few boys who did show interest usually lost it when they realized I could recite Shakespeare and calculate logarithms. Their loss, Reed said simply. Intelligence is an attractive quality. The way he looked at her as he said it, as if he found her attractive indeed, made Tamara's cheeks warm. She stood quickly, brushing crumbs from her skirt. We should get back to work if we want to finish before the rain comes. They returned to the field, and for the rest of the afternoon, they worked steadily, taking turns at the plow to give each other rest. By the time the first raindrops began to fall, they had managed to plow nearly half the field, an impressive accomplishment for a single day. We should head in, Reed called as the rain began to fall more steadily. Rusty's done enough for today, and this weather's only going to worsen. They hurried to unhitch the horse and store the plow, then made a dash for the cabin as the skies opened in earnest. By the time they reached the porch, they were both soaked through, their clothes clinging to their bodies and water streaming from their hair. Tamara couldn't help but laugh at their bedraggled appearance. So much for finishing the plowing today. Reed grinned, pushing wet hair back from his forehead. There's always tomorrow. The rain will be good for the soil, make our job easier once it dries a bit. You're welcome to come in and dry off, Tamara offered, suddenly conscious of how her wet dress outlined her figure. She crossed her arms over her chest, but the gesture only drew Reed's eyes momentarily before he politely looked away. Thank you, he said, following her into the cabin. I should see to Rusty first, though, make sure he's sheltered from the worst of it. There's room in the lean-to, Tamara suggested. It's not much, but it's dry. Reed nodded gratefully. I'll get him settled and be right back. While he was gone, Tamara quickly changed into dry clothes behind the curtain that separated her sleeping area from the main room. She hung her wet dress near the stove to dry, then stoked the fire to warm the cabin against the sudden chill the rain had brought. When Reed returned, he was even more thoroughly soaked than before. Water dripped from his clothes onto the wooden floor, forming small puddles at his feet. I'm making a mess of your floor, he apologized, looking down ruefully. It's just water, Tamara assured him, but you should get out of those wet things before you catch your death. She hesitated, then added, I have some of my father's old clothes. They might fit you well enough until yours dry. Reed's expression softened at the offer. That's very kind of you, Tamara. I'd be grateful. She retrieved a simple shirt and trousers from the trunk where she kept her father's belongings, handing them to Reed with a strange mixture of emotions. There was something intimate about offering him her father's clothes, yet it felt right somehow. You can change behind the curtain, she said, gesturing to her sleeping area. I'll make us some coffee to warm up. While Reed changed, Tamara busied herself at the stove, trying not to think about the man undressing just a few feet away, separated only by a thin curtain of fabric. The domesticity of the situation struck her suddenly, the two of them taking shelter from the rain, changing into dry clothes, preparing to share a hot drink. It felt alarmingly natural, as if they had done this 100 times before. When Reed emerged from behind the curtain, Tamara's breath caught in her throat. Her father had been a big man, but Reed filled out his clothes differently, broader in the shoulders, leaner at the waist. The simple white shirt strained slightly across his chest, and the trousers were a bit short at the ankles, but overall, the effect was not unpleasing. They're a little snug, he said apologetically, tugging at the shirt collar, but they'll do just fine until mine dry. They suit you, Tamara replied before she could stop herself. She quickly turned back to the stove, hoping he hadn't noticed the color rising in her cheeks. The coffee's almost ready. Outside, the rain fell in sheets, drumming against the roof and windows with increasing intensity. A crack of thunder made Tamara jump slightly as she poured the hot coffee into 2 mugs. Quite a storm, Reed observed, accepting the mug she offered him. Might be a while before it passes. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, sending a jolt of awareness through Tamara that had nothing to do with the lightning flashing outside. She withdrew her hand quickly, gesturing for Reed to take a seat at the table. "I hope your camp doesn't wash away," she said, sitting across from him. Reed took a sip of his coffee before responding. "I'd moved most of my gear to higher ground this morning just in case, but I admit I'm grateful to be inside right now rather than huddled under a tree." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, listening to the storm rage outside while the warmth of the coffee and the stove gradually chased the chill from their bodies. "This reminds me of evenings with my father," Tamara said softly, her gaze drawn to the window where rain streaked the glass. "On nights like this, he would read aloud by lamplight poetry mostly. Wordsworth was his favorite." Reed's expression grew thoughtful. "My father wasn't much for poetry, but he was a fine storyteller. Ghost stories, tall tales, legends from the old country, he knew them all. My brothers and I would sit spellbound for hours." "You have brothers?" Tamara asked, realizing how little she still knew about this man despite the easy companionship that had developed between them. Reed nodded, a shadow passing over his features. "Had 2 older brothers. Both died in the war, Thomas at Shiloh, James at Gettysburg." "I'm so sorry," Tamara said, instinctively reaching across the table to touch his hand. "That must have been devastating for your family." Reed turned his hand over to clasp hers briefly. "It was. My mother never really recovered from the loss. She followed them 2 years later, just seemed to fade away a little more each day until there was nothing left." The pain in his voice was evident, though clearly tempered by time. Tamara understood that kind of grief all too well. "Is that when you decided to head west?" "Yes," Reed confirmed. "There was nothing left for me in Kentucky by then. The farm was in ruins, the horses gone, the land nearly worthless after the war, so I sold what little remained and set out to find a new life." His gaze met hers across the table, steady and direct. "I've been searching ever since." Something in the way he said it made Tamara wonder if perhaps his search was nearing its end. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. "And now you're here," she said softly, helping a stranger clear stones from her field. Reed's mouth curved into that slow smile that made her heart beat faster. "Not a stranger anymore, I think." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Tamara found herself unable to look away from his eyes, drawn into their depths as surely as if he had reached out and pulled her physically closer. Another crash of thunder broke the spell, making them both start. Tamara withdrew her hand from his, rising quickly to check on their wet clothes near the stove. "Your shirt is still quite damp," she reported, grateful for the distraction, "but the vest is nearly dry." "No rush," Reed replied, his voice carrying a hint of something that made her glad her back was turned so he couldn't see her flushed face. "I'm comfortable enough for now." The storm showed no signs of abating as the afternoon wore on. After finishing their coffee, Tamara suggested a game of cards to pass the time. Reed readily agreed, and soon they were engaged in a spirited game of whist, with Tamara proving to be a more formidable opponent than Reed had anticipated. "Where did you learn to play like this?" he asked after she won their 3rd consecutive hand. "I thought you said you spent your time reciting Shakespeare, not cleaning out card sharks." Tamara laughed, gathering the cards to shuffle again. "My father believed in a well-rounded education. Besides, card games improve mathematical thinking and strategy." "Is that what you tell yourself when you're taking a man's last penny?" Reed teased, his eyes dancing with mirth. "Fortunately for you, we're not playing for money," she retorted, dealing the next hand with practiced ease. As they played, their conversation wandered from topic to topic: books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they still harbored. With each passing hour, Tamara felt the walls she had built around herself since her father's death gradually lowering, allowing Reed to glimpse the woman she truly was beneath the veneer of the stoic homesteader. And in turn, she began to see beyond Reed's charming exterior to the man within, thoughtful, intelligent, shaped by loss yet not defined by it. A man who valued hard work and honesty, who could discuss literature as easily as horse breeding, who looked at her as if she were something precious rather than just a woman alone on the frontier. By the time the rain finally began to ease late in the afternoon, Tamara realized with a start that she didn't want him to leave. The thought was as frightening as it was exhilarating. Reed seemed to sense the shift in her mood. "What's troubling you?" he asked gently as they put the cards away. Tamara shook her head, unsure how to express the tumult of emotions within her. "Nothing, just wondering if the field will be too wet to plow tomorrow." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it was far from the complete truth. Reed studied her face for a moment, as if trying to read what she left unsaid, but he didn't press the issue. "It might be," he acknowledged, "but a day of good sunshine should dry it enough to work, and if not tomorrow, then the day after. You'd still stay?" Tamara asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "You've already delayed your plans for the Campbell Ranch by several days." Reed rose from his chair, moving to the window to look out at the clearing sky. "I've been thinking about that," he said, his back to her. "The truth is, Tamara, I'm in no particular hurry to get to the Campbells, or anywhere else for that matter." He turned to face her then, his expression more serious than she had yet seen it. "These past few days working alongside you have been good, better than good. And I find myself reluctant to ride away just yet." Tamara's heart seemed to skip a beat. "What are you saying, Reed?" He took a step toward her, then another, until he stood directly before her chair. "I'm saying that if you'd be willing to have me stay a while longer to help finish the plowing, perhaps assist with the planting, I'd consider it an honor." Tamara rose slowly to her feet, acutely aware of how close they stood. "And what would you expect in return?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reed's gaze never wavered from hers. "Only what you're willing to give, Tamara, your company, your conversation, perhaps in time your trust." The sincerity in his words was unmistakable, as was the carefully restrained emotion behind them. This was no casual offer of assistance, nor was it an improper proposition. It was something far more dangerous, the beginning of a possibility that both thrilled and terrified her. "People would talk," she said, voicing one of her many concerns. "A single woman allowing a man to stay on her property." "Let them talk," Reed replied with a dismissive shake of his head. "I could make camp here on your land but maintain propriety by sleeping outside, and if anyone dares say a word against your reputation, they'll answer to me." The protective note in his voice warmed something deep inside Tamara. It had been so long since anyone had cared enough to shield her from harm or criticism. "Why, Reed?" she asked finally, needing to understand. "Why would you do this for me?" For a moment, he seemed to struggle with his answer. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke the simple truth. "Because in all my wandering, I've never met anyone quite like you, Tamara Wilson, and I'm not ready to say goodbye." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Tamara searched his face, looking for any sign of deception or ulterior motive, but found only open sincerity and something else, a warmth in his eyes that made her breath catch. "All right," she said finally, her decision made. "Stay, help me with the plowing and planting, and we'll see where it leads." The smile that broke across Reed's face was like the sun emerging from behind the storm clouds, bright and full of promise. "You won't regret it, Tamara, I give you my word." As they stood there in the quiet cabin, with the last of the rain pattering on the roof and the late afternoon sun beginning to break through the clouds, Tamara had the distinct feeling that her life had just changed course as surely as a river diverted by a fallen tree finds a new path to the sea. Whether that new course would lead to joy or heartbreak remained to be seen. But for the first time since her father's death, Tamara found herself looking toward the future with something that felt remarkably like hope. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity and growing closeness. True to his word, Reed made camp near the creek, maintaining a respectful distance from the cabin at night while working alongside Tamara from dawn till dusk each day. Together, they finished plowing the field. then carefully planted rows of wheat, corn, and vegetables. Reed built a more substantial chicken coop to replace the aging structure that had been threatening to collapse, and he repaired the sagging fence around the vegetable garden to keep rabbits and deer at bay. Each evening, they would share dinner in Tamara's cabin, talking long into the night before Reed would reluctantly return to his camp. Their conversations ranged from practical farming matters to philosophical discussions about life and purpose, each revelation bringing them closer together. Tamara found herself watching the clock each morning, anticipating the moment when Reed would appear at her door with that warm smile that seemed reserved just for her. And each night, she would stand on the porch long after he had disappeared into the darkness, a mixture of contentment and longing filling her heart. Word of Reed's presence on the Wilson homestead had indeed reached town, carried there by the Hendersons who lived 2 miles east and had spotted Reed working in the field alongside Tamara. But rather than the scandal Tamara had feared, the news was met with a mixture of approval and relief. Mrs. Peterson stopped me after church on Sunday, Tamara told Reed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. She said she'd been worrying about me out here alone and was glad to see I had a strong young man helping with the spring work. Reed chuckled, stretching his long legs out before him, and here I thought we'd be causing a scandal. Oh, there's still plenty of gossip, Tamara assured him with a small smile. But apparently most folks were already betting on how long I'd last out here alone before having to sell up or find a husband. They seem to think you're either my salvation or my downfall, depending on who's doing the talking. And which do you think I am? Reed asked, his tone light but his eyes serious as they met hers. Tamara's heart quickened at the question and all it implied. I'm still deciding, she replied softly. The truth was, she had never felt more alive than during these past weeks with Reed. His presence had transformed the homestead from a burden into a shared vision, the daily work from drudgery into partnership. When he spoke of crop rotation or suggested improvements to the irrigation system, it was always with an eye toward the future, a future he seemed to envision himself being part of. And increasingly, Tamara found herself unable to imagine that future without him in it. One particularly warm afternoon, as they finished setting fence posts around the newly expanded vegetable garden, Reed wiped sweat from his brow and gazed thoughtfully at the cabin. You know, he said, with a bit of work we could add another room to the cabin before winter. Perhaps extend it to the east, add a proper bedroom. Tamara looked up sharply from the seedlings she was transplanting. Reed met her gaze steadily, making no attempt to backtrack or qualify his statement. Yes, if you'll have me, Tamara. She sat back on her heels, heart pounding as she absorbed the implication of his words. Are you proposing to me, Reed Montgomery? Not yet, he replied with a small smile. When I do, you'll know it, but I am asking if you'd consider a future with me here on this land. Building something together day by day, Tamara's throat tightened with emotion. You barely know me, she whispered. Reed set down his tools and crossed to where she knelt, crouching beside her so their eyes were level. I know enough, he said gently. I know you're strong and stubborn and smarter than anyone I've ever met. I know you love this land with every fiber of your being. I know your laugh makes my heart skip a beat, and your sadness makes me want to move heaven and earth to ease it. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. And I know that each day I spend with you makes the thought of leaving more unbearable. Tamara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of the gesture. When she opened them again, the decision that had been forming in her heart these past weeks crystallized into certainty. Stay, she said simply. Not just for the planting or the harvest, but stay. The joy that blazed across Reed's face was answer enough, but he put it into words nonetheless. Nothing would make me happier, Tamara. For a moment, they remained there, kneeling in the freshly turned earth, the air between them charged with possibility. Then, with exquisite slowness, Reed leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss as gentle as it was profound. Tamara had been kissed before awkward, fumbling encounters with boys back in Illinois that had left her more confused than anything else. But this Reed's mouth warm and sure against hers, his hand cradling her face as if she were something infinitely precious, this was entirely different. This was coming home. When they finally drew apart, both slightly breathless, Reed rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day I saw you picking stones in this field," he admitted. Tamara laughed softly, her hands still resting on his shoulders. "That long. And here I thought you were just being neighborly." "There was nothing neighborly about my thoughts, believe me," Reed replied with a grin that made her blush. Their courtship unfolded with the changing seasons. Spring gave way to summer, the crops flourishing under their combined care. Reed moved his camp closer to the cabin, but still maintained a proper distance, mindful of Tamara's reputation despite their growing closeness. They made regular trips into town together, their relationship now acknowledged openly. If there were still whispers behind their backs, neither of them paid them any mind. What mattered was the life they were building, stone by stone, day by day. On a warm evening in late July, with the wheat field golden and heavy with promise, Reed took Tamara's hand as they walked along the creek that marked the northern boundary of her property. "Our property," he had taken to calling it, and the phrase never failed to warm her heart. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I've been saving for it since May." He withdrew a small object and held it out to her, a simple gold band with a tiny pearl set at its center. It wasn't elaborate or ostentatious, but in the fading light of day it gleamed with all the promise of their future. "Tamara Wilson," Reed said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "I love you more than I ever thought possible. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears welled in Tamara's eyes as she looked from the ring to the man holding it, this man who had appeared in her life just when she needed him most, who had worked alongside her without complaint, who had shown her that strength could be found in partnership rather than solitude. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Reed Montgomery, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he kissed her this time, there was no hesitation, only the certainty of two hearts that had found their home in each other. They were married in early September, after the wheat harvest was safely in. The ceremony took place in the small church in town, with what seemed like the entire community in attendance. The Hendersons stood as witnesses, Mrs. Henderson dabbing at her eyes throughout the ceremony, while her husband nodded approvingly as Tamara and Reed exchanged their vows. "Never thought I'd see the day," Mr. Jenkins from the general store remarked to anyone who would listen. "That Wilson girl was always too independent for her own good. But I suppose even the most stubborn filly can be tamed by the right hand." Mrs. Peterson, overhearing, fixed him with a steely glare. "Nonsense, Jenkins. Anyone with eyes can see it's not about taming. Those two are partners, plain and simple. And from the look of their harvest this year, it's a partnership that works." Indeed, the Wilson Montgomery homestead had produced the finest wheat crop in the county that summer, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by their neighbors. What had begun as skepticism about Tamara's ability to manage alone had transformed into respect for what she and Reed were accomplishing together. After the ceremony, they hosted a simple celebration at the homestead. Tables were set up in the yard, laden with food contributed by neighboring families. There was music and dancing, laughter and good wishes, as the community came together to celebrate not just a marriage, but the kind of pioneering spirit that bound them all together in this challenging land. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Reed found Tamara standing alone near the edge of the wheat field, her wedding dress glowing in the golden light. "Having second thoughts, Mrs. Montgomery?" he asked teasingly as he came up behind her, slipping his arms around her waist. Tamara leaned back against him, covering his hands with her own. "Not one," she replied. "I was just thinking about my father, how much I wish he could have been here today." Reed pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "I like to think he was, in a way." His spirit is in every inch of this land, every board of that cabin, and I promise you, Tamara, I'll honor his memory by helping you build the dream he started." Tamara turned in his arms to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears and love. "Our dream now," she corrected him. "Yours and mine, ours," Reed agreed and sealed the promise with a kiss as their guests cheered in the background. That night, after the last guest had departed and they were finally alone, Reed carried Tamara across the threshold of the cabin, their home now in every sense. They had spent the past month expanding it, as Reed had suggested, adding a proper bedroom and reinforcing the structure against the coming winter. As they stood in the quiet of their home, the reality of their new life together settled around them like a comfortable blanket. They were no longer two solitary souls fighting separate battles against the wilderness. They were partners, bound by love and common purpose, facing whatever challenges came their way together. "I love you, Tamara Montgomery," Reed whispered against her hair, the new name still sounding wonderful to both their ears. "And I love you, Reed," she replied, lifting her face for his kiss. "More than I ever thought possible." In the years that followed, the Wilson Montgomery homestead flourished. They expanded their fields, added a small orchard, and built a proper barn to house Rusty and the 2 draft horses they eventually acquired. Their crops consistently yielded better than most in the county, thanks to Reed's innovative farming techniques and Tamara's meticulous record-keeping and planning. In the spring of their 2nd year of marriage, Tamara gave birth to a son they named Thomas James, after Reed's brothers. 2 years later, a daughter followed, Sarah Elizabeth, named for both their mothers. The cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and the sound of children's laughter became as familiar a part of the homestead as the crowing of roosters at dawn. Reed proved to be as devoted a father as he was a husband, teaching Thomas to ride almost before the boy could walk, reading to both children each night just as Tamara's father had once read to her. Tamara, meanwhile, ensured their education went far beyond the practical skills needed for frontier life, instilling in them the love of literature and learning that had been her own inheritance. On the 5th anniversary of the day Reed had first stopped to help Tamara in that stone-filled field, they stood together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set over wheat fields that stretched far beyond what Tamara had once struggled to clear alone. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" Tamara asked, leaning against Reed's shoulder as his arm wrapped securely around her waist. Reed considered the question, his gaze taking in all they had built together: the thriving farm, the happy children, the life filled with purpose and love. "I believe some things are meant to be," he said finally. "I was searching for something I couldn't name, riding from place to place without finding peace. And then I saw you in that field, stubborn and determined, fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win alone." He turned to look at her, his eyes still holding the same warmth they had on that first day. "In that moment, something inside me simply knew this is where I belong, not just on this land, but by your side." Tamara smiled, remembering her initial suspicion of his motives, how she had questioned why a stranger would offer help without expecting payment. How far they had come since then, how much they had learned about trust and partnership, about building a life stone by stone, day by day. "I'm glad you stopped," she said simply, reaching up to touch his cheek. "And I'm even more glad you stayed." Reed covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm. "Always," he promised. "For as long as there are stones to clear and fields to plow, for as long as there are stars in the sky and breath in my body, I will stay by your side." Tamara Montgomery. As the last light of day faded into dusk, they remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering darkness. The homestead around them stood as testament to what could be accomplished when 2 hearts worked as one, not just surviving the wilderness, but transforming it into a place of beauty, abundance, and love. And it had all begun with those simple words spoken by a passing cowboy to a woman struggling alone. Let me help you.